Colleagues, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We are going to look at specifically at effective communication and feedback. So if we stand still at the title of what we're going to share, I think it's important that we just look at that for a minute because we talk about feedback, but in a sense, in a psychological sense, or coming from industrial psychology, if we talk about feedback, it quite often means uncomfortable conversations. Those conversations that you know you should have, but we're all a little bit afraid to have. We want to put it off. And then if we do have those conversations, sometimes we're a little bit emotional, perhaps a bit upset. So I'm going to talk about, we'll share our presentation between ourselves and Dr. Engelbrecht. So I'm going to talk about the practical skill of sharing my ideas and then listening to others' ideas. And these are both skills that you can practice. We are not born with them naturally, so you can increase your ability to communicate effectively. And then we're going to take a step back and just put those skills into context and say, but you know, we all have a natural way of communicating, and that is what Dr. Engelbrecht or Louise is going to share with us. So if we jump right in, let me go to the next slide, and we talk about communication. I'm sure all of you know that communication is actually quite complex. I think most of us want to think that it's a cognitive process where we just share ideas, and most of the time, if the circumstances are ideal and everyone is calm and happy, then communication happens easily and it's enjoyable. But in some instances, and specifically in the working environment, this is not always the case, because we all come to the working environment with our own set of values, etc. So this training session focuses on skills that you can use to navigate crucial or difficult conversations. Using these skills will enable you to build stronger relationships and then also hopefully to lead and manage better in your school settings. So this next slide is a summary of, if we talk about communication, how the three different elements fit together. You will see that there's an element of self. So our natural communication style is influenced by ourself, and Louise will give you some information on that as well. Our self-concept, our personality, our values, our past experiences all have an impact. Our personal style, that we're also going to look at, your personal preference, what we are most comfortable with, what we see the other person to be and what others have done in the past. And then the third thing is our skills and how well developed our skills, our communication skills are, because the better developed our skills are, the less we will have to depend on our natural style of communication, and the more cognitive our process of communication will be, and the more I want to say in charge, but of the interaction and the communication we will be. So during this presentation, I'm specifically then going to look at our skills that we use for communication, and these are learned behavior. As I said, learned behaviors, everyone can use it, and then the golden I think phrase is practice makes perfect. And when we practice our communication and listening skills and our assertiveness skills, at the beginning I think it's a bit methodical, you know, it's like learning to drive a car. You feel very stupid if you do it, but if you continue with it and you stick with it, then over time it becomes natural. So if we look at communication skills, I'm going to specifically focus on two elements of communication, and that will be our influencing skills. How do we influence others? You can also call it assertiveness skills. Okay, how do I assert my own position in a communication situation? And then the other one would be active listening skills. So what we do when I communicate with someone is I continuously toggle between influencing and listening, and influencing and listening. And if we are, we've practiced these skills and we're good at it, what we find is that leaders have the ability, when they do communicate, they have a switch in their brain that says, and that they force themselves to say, you know what, I'm not going to go into listening mode. And you take out the emotion of that situation and you focus on active listening. Or you say, I want to influence this person. How should I phrase what I want to say to have the best and most advantageous impact for myself? So we're going to toggle between influencing skills and active listening skills. And everything starts with the question, who owns the problem or the issue? Okay, so if I go into a communication, I'm going to ask myself, who owns the issue? In other words, do I own the issue and I want to share with someone else what I want them to do? Or it might be a situation where someone else comes into my office and they want to share something that they want me to do, or a concern, or something like that, and then they own the issue. So that would be the two kind of starting places. Is it either myself or the other person who owns the issue or the problem? So if we say, I want to make it practical, so I'm going to look at a scenario. So scenario 1 would be, a teacher comes into your office and asks if she can take leave this coming Friday to travel to her uncle's funeral. So if I ask now the audience and our participants, what do you think would be, what situation would this be? Would this be me owning the problem, or would this be the other person owning the problem? Scenario 1. If a teacher comes into your office, say you're the principal, and asks if they can take leave this coming Friday. Perhaps I can get a few thumbs up if I say, is this a problem that is owned by me? Or is this a problem that is owned by the person coming into the office? In other words, the other person. Aha, Manuela is giving her thumbs up. Yes, Manuela, you are correct. So that would be a situation where the other person owns the problem. If I call a teacher, I'm the headmaster, and I call a teacher in to ask him not to raise his voice against the students, even if they made him very mad, then obviously I'm owning the problem, or I'm owning the issue, and I'm going to share whatever is on my mind with that person. All right, so if we then say I'm owning the problem, I'm going to use my influencing skills. And if the other person owns the problem, I'm going to use my listening skills. Okay, let's make it more practical. I've got a little video that's going to make I statements explain that a little bit. So if we do influencing skills, what we use to do influencing skills, or to influence other people, if I want to share something really difficult, the best way to formulate the message is to put it in an I statement. And I'm sure some of you might have heard about I statements in the past. Let's quickly listen to this video and then we'll continue the presentation.
One of the most powerful communication tools we have available to us is the concept of I statements. Let me explain. You might have heard that it's useful to clearly communicate how we feel to others. You might even already be doing that, only to find that your efforts result in more conflict. Why isn't this working? Well, it's not just about what you communicate. How you communicate it is just as important. At times when we're trying to communicate our feelings or explain what we want from others, we tend to rely on you statements. These statements direct fault or blame at the other person. We often use you statements to say, you're the reason I'm upset. But isn't that logical? They did something I don't like and I want things to be different. That may be true, But placing the responsibility for how we feel onto somebody else is likely to elicit counter-argument or defensiveness. If you attempt to address your own feelings by focusing on someone else's actions, you're directing them to also focus on their actions. This can easily turn into an argument about different interpretations of facts or behavior. This distracts from the thing that started the whole conversation in the first place, your feelings. If, instead, you open the dialogue with the focus on you and your feelings, you have a better chance of engaging somebody in a productive conversation. Here's where I statements come in. I statements are a really helpful way to assert our feelings and needs without attacking the other person. They take responsibility for how we feel and focus the conversation around our feelings. No one can argue with our feelings or disprove them or say they didn't really happen. The first thing to think about when forming an I statement is, what is it that you're trying to communicate or achieve? It could just be that you want the other person to acknowledge your feelings. Notice how, when the statements are changed to reflect our feelings, they're less blaming and accusatory. There are 4 steps to formulating an I statement. Make an honest statement about how you're feeling and take responsibility for your feelings. Be careful not to say, I feel like you, or I feel that you, because those are you statements disguised as I statements. Instead, feel should always be followed by an emotion, such as angry, sad, or frustrated. Tell the person the action or behavior that triggered your feelings. Be specific about the situation and try to talk about the present rather than the past. Next, tell the person what it is about their behavior or its consequences that you don't like. Be specific about why you feel that way. Finally, tell the person what you need or want from them now or in the future when similar situations come up. Be careful about phrasing things as demands, such as, you better, or next time you will. When we take all those pieces and put them together, it looks like this. And that's how you turn a you statement into an I statement. These kinds of statements can be perceived as exposing us or making us feel more vulnerable because we're admitting that we have feelings and we're asking other people to care about those feelings. Using these statements can take a bit of getting used to, but with a little bit of practice, it can become really liberating for both you and the people around you. So, write the formula down, try it out a couple times. Think about a few situations in the past where you could have used an I statement instead of a you statement. And next time you want to communicate how you're feeling or what you need from someone, try framing it as an I statement. One of the most powerful...
Okay, so I'm going to summarize then an I statement, and you can copy this from the screen. This will be like... what do you want to, what can I say? You're allowed to take notes and make a crib note for yourself that you can refer to. Oh, I hear someone's mic is on. Okay, so we state the problem in a clear, non-judgmental way. I feel, and there's an example, I feel upset if you come late for our meeting, because then my schedule for the rest of the day also runs late. That would be a typical way of using an I statement instead of, I can't believe that you are late again. All right, so I think we all have the hang of that. That would be influencing skills and I statements. Now what happens, normally if I own the problem and I share it, then the other person is obviously going to respond to what I've just said. And then I go into the mode of listening. And really, really listening, we call active listening. So if the problem, who owns the problem, is now the other person, then I do active listening. So active listening is when the shared problem or the issue is with the other person, and he or she is upset or emotional about it. They also don't have to always be upset or emotional. It can just be a conversation where they are requesting you something of you, or they've come to share something with you. But in this case now, the other person comes to share a problem or the issue with me, and I'm going to do active listening. Now, active listening, I'm also going to break that down into a number of steps and things that you can go and practice and implement in your working environment. And the reason why we want to active listen is not just so that we really understand and know what the other person is saying. That is why we do it. But the real reason behind it is that so that we can build relationship, and so that we as leaders can impact other people and really connect with them on an emotional level. Because at the end of the day, people don't follow leaders because they have to. They follow leaders because there's an emotional relationship and respect for the leader. So if you do not listen to people, the research has shown us that subordinates are not very open to building relationships with leaders who are not active listeners and don't make time for their subordinates or teachers that work for them. So if we look at active listening, I've got another video here that sums it up much better than what I can do. So I'm going to play that for you, and then I'm going to summarize what the video said, and then Louise will take it further. So let's listen to this video about active listening.
We're going to talk about active listening skills. So let's get into the details. Hey there, I'm Alex Lyon, and I actually have a 1-hour course on effective listening skills for leaders. I will tell you more about that at the end of the video. So listening is so important because good listening is probably the easiest way to connect with other people and build relationships. Active listening is the opposite of passive listening, and you have probably experienced this. The person you're talking to might technically be hearing some of what you're saying, but they are tuned out, they're on autopilot, and they're just not mentally engaged with what you're saying. And as the speaker, this can be very dissatisfying, very discouraging when people really aren't paying attention to us. Like, why am I even talking in the first place? But active listening looks, sounds, and feels obvious. Active listening means listening completely. But before anybody does that well, there are two prerequisites to active listening. Number one, you have to commit. You have to put aside whatever else might be distracting you and make listening a real priority. Good listening is first and foremost a choice that you make every time somebody speaks. Number two, it takes practice. Like any skill, you have to work at it. The good news is that listening is not mysterious or complicated. So let's talk about 4 qualities of active listening that you can put into practice. First, active listening involves nonverbal communication. And there are 2 sides to this. On the one hand, you're demonstrating that you're engaged in paying attention nonverbally. You put your devices completely away, you make eye contact, your body posture is open and oriented toward the other person. Now, on the other side, you're also noticing the speaker's nonverbal cues. There's an expression, you listen with your eyes. And part of that means you're noticing what's happening with the person visually on their mood or their emotion that they're showing. Do they look nervous, frustrated, annoyed? You can pick up on that by actively observing their nonverbal communication. Second, active listening involves verbal communication. Again, there are 2 sides to this. The most obvious part is asking good questions. Probably the most common pattern that good listeners demonstrate is that they ask a good question and then they let the speaker fully answer it. Like a good mental health therapist will ask thoughtful questions and then stop talking for a while and let the client speak. Honestly, what we're paying for in many cases is just somebody to listen carefully to us. So a good question is a huge part of the listening pie. And the other part of verbal communication is those small utterances that show the other person that we're following them, like, I hear you, yeah, that makes sense. Sometimes it's not even full words. It might just be, oh. Those little utterances keep us engaged and show the other person that we're following. Third, active listening involves responding to what somebody just said. So the pattern goes like this. You ask a question, they respond for however long that takes, and at the end of that talking term, you give an informed response to them. So let's say you just ask a person what they've been up to lately. That's your question. And in their talking turn, they tell you that they have been doing diving lately. So you actively listen for a while they're talking. And at the end of their talking turn, it's your turn again. And this is where you show that you were actively following along and were interested in what they were saying. And you can do this by reflecting back what you just heard. You might say something like, wow, that sounds like an exciting sport. That's really cool that you're doing that. Or you could ask another follow-up question. I had no idea that you were into diving. How did you first get into that? Of course, you could do a little bit of both, like I just did. You could make an informed, reflective statement and then ask a follow-up question. The key is to respond to what they have just been saying. What you don't want to do is just look at them blankly and not react when they're done talking. And you've probably had somebody do this to you. You tell them about part of your day or something about your life, and they don't react. They just have this stone face. That's not active listening. If you want a gold star for active listening, then you have to respond to what they just said. Fourth, keep the focus on them and let them talk. Now, this one might seem obvious because you're listening, but when you decide to go into that listening mode, just make a decision that this is going to be all about the other person talking and not about you. Resist that temptation to jump in with your own story or to change the subject to your favorite topic. Keep your talking turns and questions concise, and then stick to whatever topic they're interested in. Now, eventually, once they've done plenty of talking, there will usually be an opportunity later in the conversation for you to share your experiences. But my rule of thumb is to dedicate at least the first half of the conversation to pure active listening. So I hope these 4 tips help you listen completely.
But I think he did very clearly explain to us this slide that I now summarized the qualities of active listening. So if you remember, he said it involves verbal communication, but then also non-verbal communication. I think we sometimes forget the non-verbal communication, especially with our phones close to us. So there's a summary of what it means to communicate in a non-verbal manner. And then if we say we also then communicate verbally, to ask good questions, to say and the small utterances that show that you are following, then responding to what someone has just said, either summarizing their feelings or paraphrasing what they've said or reflecting what you've just heard, or by asking a follow-up question, and then to keep the focus on them and let them talk. So I think we've now summarized between our communication skills, jumping between active listening and influencing or assertiveness skills in any situation. These are the 2 that you want to focus on. If we now take a step back and we think about the bigger picture and how our personality and our values and our natural communication style might influence our ability to really focus on our active listening and our influencing skills, then we're going to listen to Louise, who's going to share some information on crucial conversations with us. Louise, if you're there, I'm going to go to the next slide and you can take over from me.
Thank you so much, Liesel. For a moment, I'll just switch on my camera so that everybody can at least put a face against the voice. And you can go to the next slide, Liesel. Thank you. Okay, I just want to say again, thank you for Liesel, because I think it will really fit well into the crucial conversations. And you can just keep this slide. You can just go back to the previous slide, please. Um, and thank you so much for reminding us about influencing and listening skills, which is actually the basics of communication. Sorry, I'm just going to switch off my camera.
I just want to make sure, Louise, there's this one, and then we're starting there.
You can actually go back to crucial conversations, please.
Okay.
That's right. Thank you so much. Now, I think Liesel actually already touched on the crucial conversations because by now, well, you can obviously know that if it's a problem, it's me. It starts with me or you who owns the problem. Then there's immediately a crucial conversation. Liesel, maybe okay. Sorry. I could just heard the echo in the background. So a crucial conversation is actually where stakes are high and where there's strong emotions and opposing opinions. So you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so how do we master crucial conversations? You master that through dialogue. Now, dialogue is the free flow of meaning between two or more people. Now, to have free flow of meaning takes skill, emotional intelligence, and care. Now, when you have dialogue, it means when you move between influencing and listening skills, there's obviously dialogue. Then you have a crucial conversation, which can actually improve your relationships and your personal health. Now, when you are able to manage your crucial conversations well, you can also make better decisions, especially when you share your honest opinion in a respectful way. So these are quite important because you need to take care of the other person and be respectful towards another person and, put your feelings aside and just think about the mutual purpose of why are we here, and then that's actually the most
Louise, I opened the link. I'm not sure if the participants can see what it looks like now or whether I'm still sharing the slides. But
That's perfect. I see the link from your side. Thank you so much.
okay.
I see there's a hand from Percy. Oh, can you see it? Okay, I'll give everybody, let's give it 5 minutes to answer that questions because it's 30 questions. It should be earlier, but let me give everybody 5 minutes. Okay, thank you, George. I saw your comment. Okay, so let's look at understanding your results. So the results actually look at your style under stress, and your dialogue skills. Now, your style under stress scores indicate actually how you frequently fall into these less than perfect strategies, whether it's silence or violence. So it's actually possible to score high in both. You can actually be high on silence and high on violence. High score, that means 1 or 2, means that you use this technique fairly often. So you will see in this case, this person has a 2 at avoiding. So that's the default option towards silence, and also withdrawing. That's also a 2. And then when we look at violence, you will see attacking is a 2. So this person either will withdraw or maybe attack people, when the conversations get tough. So this just gives you an indication that we are actually all human, and that most people tend to toggle between holding back or becoming too forceful. So I'm not sure whether any one of you want to maybe, sorry, I'm not going to ask you to share because we are quite limited for time, after which you are welcome to share. But I'm sure you can see that there's silence and violence, and that's actually basically our default back for. It's also related to fight or flight. That's just how we as humans are wired. When we are feared, when we feel that our safety is under stress, we go back to our default options. We either fight or flight, or we go silence or violence, even in our communication styles. Okay, so Liesel, can you please go to the next slide? Thank you so much. And the other thing about the results is also it gives you an overview of your dialogue skills score. Now, this assessment is obviously based on the Crucial Conversations book and the whole training. So I would really suggest that you try to get hold of a copy of the Crucial Conversations. It's really a very good book. There's also online training that's virtually. I don't want to market them, but really, if you can at least get hold of the book, it's really a good book. And you will see the dialogue skills provide a score of which chapters you need to focus on. So if you score a 1 or a 2, it means that skill of you is actually well developed, and that's actually good. And then it's actually a strength of you. And then you can also see that there's some chapters related to the book that shows a 0, and then that just means that there's time for improvement. There's actually chapters where you can actually polish your skills, like start with heart, master my stories, learn to look. Sometimes we really struggle to read the situations. Liesel, can you please go to the next slide? Okay, so it's quite important, we always need to be self-reflective and to explore ourselves. So it's really important to look for when the conversation tend to violence or to silence. Now, silence is actually purposefully withholding information from the pool, and these can relate to 3 things. You either masking, like you're sugarcoating something, or you are sarcastic, or people tend to make a cough, or it means you don't want to address the problem actually. So also silence is also playing verbal games, to avoid the person entirely. That also relates to silence. But what I want to say further about masking is, you understate, or you selectively showing your true opinions. It's like you don't get to the point, and yeah, I think you get the idea of masking. Everybody can relate to sarcasm and sugarcoating. And then you actually get avoiding. Now, avoiding means involving, it means moving away completely from sensitive subjects. And, sometimes we talk, but without addressing the real issue. You don't get to talk about that. Everybody just gets silent about that. Then you are avoiding the situation, or that's the avoiding is the default style then, or option. Now then you get withdrawing, and withdrawing is actually, it means pulling out of the conversation altogether. You leave the room. You either say, no, I can't take it, I need to take this call, I just need to go to the toilet, or whatever. It means you mark yourself a footer, you're totally avoiding the situation and you're withdrawing from it. Thank you so much, Liesl. You can go to the next slide. And then we get to violence. Now, violence is actually, thank you so much, Liesl. Now, violence consists of any verbal strategy that attempts to convince, control, or to compel others to your point of view. It actually violates safety by trying to force meaning into the pool. So silence and violence just mean the person is not safe, you need to be careful. It's really a conversation that's getting crucial, and you need to make it safe again. Now, when we look at controlling, that's actually coercing others to your way of thinking. It's either you force your views on them, or you dominate the conversation. And then labeling is, you put a label on people or ideas so that you can dismiss them under a general stereotype or a category. And then attacking that speaks actually for itself. You moved from winning an argument to making the person suffer by belittling someone, or to threaten. If you don't do this, it's that. I think we all know what attacking means. So these are basically the big issues. It's silence or violence. Can you please go to the next slide, Liesl? Thank you. So I think when we look at silence and violence and influencing skills and listening skills, we can actually see for ourselves that safety problems normally relate to the content. Now, that's obvious, and also the condition of the conversation. When people don't feel safe, they either defend themselves, go to violence, or they either withdraw and go silent. That's normally the default option. So when it's safe, you can actually say anything. So it's quite important to pay attention when you see when people don't feel safe. Because I'm sure you can think about a situation where someone give you bad news or bad feedback, and you were actually able to embrace that. And think about that. It's really because you were feeling safe. So that's just the importance of feeling safe. And then when it's unsafe, you can start to go blind. Because really, if it's unsafe, your brain shut down, people. Really, it's in the neuroscience. I want to say it straight away. It's really in the neuroscience. When you're unsafe, you start to go blind. You can't think. Your reptile brain starts to function, and your prefrontal cortex, the problem-solving brain, it shuts down. So it's really important to make it feel safe, because So that means make sure that you brief, focus on the facts, and then, pay attention to the what and the how. Like, make sure that you provide content that is accurate, and also make sure on the condition how you extend that. And then don't let safety problems lead you astray. Like I said, focus on the facts, focus on the relationship, and all those. The influencing skills and the listening skills, those come back together. I think my time is running out, Liesel. Can you please move to the next slide? Okay, so how do you make it safe? I'm quickly going to summarize in this way. Think about your mutual purpose and mutual respect. That's so important, because mutual purpose is that you believe that I care about your goals and you care about my goals, and that is actually to serve the school, to serve the children, and to serve the community. So make sure that you have that in mind. And then mutual respect is whenever you need to engage with anyone, make sure that you believe that I care about you as a person, and that person also cares about you as a person, because that's actually the basics. I don't want to say communication 101, but if we can just have or remember our mutual purpose and our mutual respect in our schools, then we will definitely have less problems. And then there's 3 skills. I don't want to laugh, but it's just basic. I think we need to get back to the basics as human beings. Apologize sincerely when it's necessary. And the second thing is contrast to fix understandings. Sometimes people hear the message, they hear your words, but they misinterpret it. So fix that. And then create that mutual purpose. You can create mutual purpose by committing to seek mutual purpose, like saying, hey, we are here as teachers to fulfill our purpose. I mean, to teach the children of South Africa and to build a future for them. And make sure that you recognize the purpose behind the strategy. Always remember why we are teachers and why you are actually a principal, to lead your teachers and to lead your children. And then also, if they don't know the purpose why they are here, then invent a mutual purpose. Create something, and then you can also brainstorm on new strategies. And then last slide. Thank you so much, Liesel. Lisa, you can go to the next slide, please.
I already did.
Thank you so much. And then one last thought about having crucial conversations is make sure that you take action. These are very nice stuff to know. Like, I feel this when you do that because I want to do that, or I need you to do this in the future. And, that's how we solve problems. But at the end, it's important to take action, because it's important to document who does what, by when, and how will we follow up. If I can leave you with this regarding crucial conversations and having good communication and feedback, this is what I want to leave you with. I hope you really had an enjoyable session with me and Liesel, and I wish you all the best with the next session.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is Annette Snyman speaking. I'm also part of the team from UNISA. I just want to say thank you to Louise and Liesel for equipping us with all of these practical skills in active listening and using I statements and creating safe spaces for crucial conversations. Tools that really strengthen our professional relationships. So thank you very much. And if there are any questions, please feel free to ask them. And then I will now hand over to Dr. Monica Kirsten, who will guide us on labor relations and legal compliance. Over to you, Monica.
Thank you. Let me just see if you can see me. Sorry. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just showing you what I look like. I am a human. I'm not a AI robot. So we're going to have this conversation about labor relations matters today. So this is what I look like. I'm going to turn my camera off. You will see that I posted a comment in the chats just asking you, sorry, I was under the impression that there would be a break between the sessions. But if you have a moment, I would like to ask you, just post a comment in the chat. Doesn't have to be a long story, but if there are specific issues that you deal with in your environment relating to labor relations, let me know. Just post it in the chat, brief comments, so that we can make sure that those are the issues that we deal with in this session. If I didn't introduce myself, sorry, my name is Monica Kirsten. I'm going to deal with labor relations and legal compliance today. And just some full disclosure on my side, I'm not a labor lawyer. I haven't studied law. I am a human resource management practitioner specializing in labor relations matters, and I am actually dealing with that from a industrial psychology point of view. In other words, my focus is on the relationships, and I'm so glad that Liesel and Louise had the session before me and focusing on communication, because that for me is ultimately the focus. It's on building relationships with the people around you. Unfortunately, when it comes to labor relations matters, the focus is very often on conflict and dealing with grievances, dealing with disputes and so on. When I started working on this presentation, I looked at the news reports and I wanted to see what's going on in the education environment in terms of labor relations. And it's actually extremely disheartening if I look at this. And for me, these are some of the examples that you deal with in the labor relations context in your environments. I feel sorry for you because it's not easy. It's not easy dealing with problematic employees or unhappy employees and dealing with this whole conflict element of the relationship. And therefore, what I want to do today is just to give you some pointers. It's impossible to deal with everything in detail in a 45 minutes time slot. So I want to give you some pointers, and I want to encourage you at any time during this session. I'm not going to wait for questions at the end. If you have questions, just put up your hand. And if I don't see you, hopefully Alda or Annette will stop me and tell me there's a question. And let's engage. Let's answer those questions that you are struggling with instead of me giving you a lot of information that you can just as well read somewhere along the line. So let's have a look. What's the objectives of this session? I engaged with your team before the session just to find out what the idea is, what you were looking for. And generally, the feeling was that you want to be able to confidently engage with various role players, and that includes your employees, your trade union representatives, labor relations officials at the district and provincial offices and so forth, so that you know what to do, so that you understand what your rights are, what your responsibilities are, and so that you won't be on the back foot, so that you will be prepared to deal with anything that comes your way. What we are going to look at is just the different stakeholders and how they fit into this relationship. We're going to look at some of the key acts so that you know which acts you need to be aware of in terms of labor relations. We're going to look at constitutional rights and what that says in terms of your responsibilities. We're going to touch on grievances and disciplinary processes so that you know that there are certain procedures that you need to follow. And we're just going to touch very briefly on dispute resolution. I hope that that will address your needs. Okay, so let's start with the employment relationship. If you ask people about labor relations and you ask them what is labor relations, they normally come up with something along the lines of the relationship between an employer and an employee, and very often they bring in the trade unions as well, because in South Africa, we know about trade unions, we deal with them and we see them in the news and so forth. But it's not that simple. The employment relationship is quite complex, and I want to say, especially in your context, it is really not simple. Why do I say this? You don't have one employer. There are various levels of employment and employer parties within this relationship in your context. You've got the National Department of Basic Education. You've got different provincial departments responsible for education. You have various district offices that deal with certain matters. Then you've got school governing bodies, because not all your educators are appointed by the Department of Basic Education. They are often appointed by the schools in a private capacity. And also then you've got federations of school governing bodies, such as FETSAs, who actually look in that at the school governing bodies and their functions in a more holistic way. On the other hand of the spectrum, you've got trade unions. There are various trade unions representing people in the education context. The biggest one is obviously the South African Democratic Teachers Union. They've got about 250,000 members in the last publication that I've seen. So as a school principal, you will definitely deal with trade unions and trade union representatives and trade union members as well, and you need to be aware of their rights within the labor relations context in South Africa. To make it even more complicated, you've got bargaining councils. So you're not only looking at what the employer says and what they publish in terms of rules and regulations and legislation and so forth, but you also have bargaining councils, and specifically at a national level, you've got the Public Service Coordinating Bargaining Council, who deals with all public service employees, employment relations matters, and at a sectoral level, under this Public Services Coordinating Bargaining Council, you've got the Education Labor Relations Council. Okay, that's a mouthful, and that's only the role players, right? And that's saying that the employment relationship is crucial, but it is complex, and we need to enable you to deal with the matters relating to this relationship that comes your way. Just for interest's sake, if you're not familiar with the bargaining councils, so the bargaining councils are basically bodies that are established between employers and employees in a certain industry or a sector, and they are normally responsible not only for collective bargaining in that sector or area, but also for dispute resolution. So for the public service, you'll have the National Bargaining Council, but specifically for education, those matters are dealt with at a sector level by the Education Labor Relations Council. The employer side in the council is represented by the Department of Basic Education. The trade unions side is mostly represented by SATU. Approximately 70% of the membership is SATU. It consists of SATU members. And then the other trade unions make up a coalition, which they call the Combined Trade Union of Autonomous Teachers Unions. That's what the CTU-ATU stands for. And that makes up the remaining 30% of the employer or employee or trade union representation in this Education Labor Relations Council. Now what happens? We deal with various people. As I've indicated, you've got various people in your schools. Many of them, or most of them, probably are appointed by the Department of Basic Education, and they are regulated by a certain group of laws. In the South African context, if you deal with labor relations management, and this goes for all private and public organizations, there are certain acts that we apply, starting with the Constitution and the organizational rights that are provided for in the Constitution. Very importantly, the Labor Relations Act, which regulates most of the labor relations aspects, and then specific acts that deals with, for instance, conditions of employment and occupational health and safety, skills development, and so forth. Now, this is not going to be our focus today because as an employer of an educator, there are other laws and other procedures that apply. In terms of the legislation, there's also a range of codes of good practice that would apply in the workplace. And although these principles of these codes of good practice apply to you, in essence, there are very specific guidelines that are drawn up by the various role players within the education context. Now, this is where we're going to look at labor relations. My focus is specifically on those educators that are appointed by the Department of Education in terms of the Employment of Educators Act. In other words, I'm not focusing on administrative staff that are appointed under the Public Service Act. I'm also not looking at educators or other staff that are appointed by the governing bodies, because they resort under the Labor Relations Act. I want to look at your educators that are regulated by the Employment of Educators Act and the various resolutions and collective agreements that apply. So what you need to be aware of is that they are regulated by this Act. The Employment of Educators Act regulates teachers' conditions of service, their appointments, promotions, and transfers, termination of these teachers, and also dealing with cases of incapacity and misconduct. There are aspects of the personnel administrative measures that will also apply to you, and we will look at those. Then there are some PSCBC resolutions. In other words, this is for the public sector. It's agreed upon at a national level that apply to your environment, and various collective agreements that are reached at the Education Labor Relations Council that will then apply to everyone, all workplaces that fall under that particular definition. In order to then filter this down to the schools, you've got your provincial departments, and the provincial departments will typically publish circulars where they deal with certain issues, where they provide guidelines then in terms of dealing with. These are some of the examples that are obtained from the Gauteng Department of Education's website, dealing with grievances, dealing with misconduct and incapacity, time off for various union activities, and aspects such as strike management. You must please stop me if you've got a question. I'm rushing through this just for time's sake. Okay, so first, let us just focus on the Constitution and why the Constitution is important. We must remember that the Constitution, and specifically Chapter 2 of the Constitution, which we call the Bill of Rights, is applicable to every person in South Africa. So irrespective of which employment relationship you are in, these rights will apply. And this is what sets the basis for any other act, regulation, collective agreement. It needs to be in line with the constitutional rights. Some of the rights that are relevant within a labor relations context would be the right to equality, which basically says that every person is equal before the law and that everyone has equal right to protection and benefit from the law. We've got the right to human dignity, which basically say that every person has the right to be respected and protected. The right to privacy means that you can't just search a person randomly or their property. You can't seize their possessions. And it also relates to communication. You can't just intercept communication without following appropriate procedures. In a labor relations context, importantly, assembly, demonstration, picketing, and petition, you will most likely have to deal with strikes and picketing in your environments. Also important in terms of labor relations, the right to freedom of association. In a general context, it just says that everyone's got the right to freedom of association, and we will look at it in a bit more detail on how it applies to the labor relations context. But what you need to remember is that no right is unlimited. If you look at Section 36 of the Constitution, it provides for the limitation of rights, and there are certain conditions under which these rights will be limited. In other words, if I say that there is a right to picketing, for instance, it doesn't mean that there's no rules of conduct. There's a limitation in terms of those rights, and that's why there are particular rules in terms of strikes, when strikes will be protected, and when picketing action as part of those strike actions would be protected. So it's not a blind right that you have because it's a constitutional right. There are still protections that are built into the specific legislation. Just a note, Section 196 of the Constitution then regulates the Public Service Commission, and this is also relevant to you as it outlines the role in, for instance, grievance handling, procedures, and recruitment, transfers, promotions, and dismissal, and so on. So that's just a notification for you to understand where all of this comes from. What happens now? You've got constitutional rights, and then you've got laws of specific application, where these laws actually give effect to the constitutional rights. In a labor relations context, the first thing that we are going to just touch on is the right to freedom of association. Now, what does this mean? What does the right to freedom of association mean? Is there anyone who would like to, oh, well, you've got the answer there, so it's no use asking. In terms of the right to freedom of association, it doesn't mean that you have the right to be friends with anyone in your workplace. It's specific to the labor relations context, and it relates to the whole idea of collectivity and collective bargaining. It means that as an employee, you have the right to trade union membership. It means that you have the right to join a trade union, you can form a trade union, you can stand for election as a trade union representative or an official of a trade union. It also means that as an employer, you may not discriminate based on trade union membership. In other words, if you need to make a decision, for instance, on a promotion, you cannot promote a person or refuse to promote a person based on their trade union membership and activities because they have the right to freedom of association. It also applies to persons seeking employment. In other words, if you appoint a new person in your environment, they also have the right to freedom of association. It means that if a person writes on their CV when applying for a position, indicating that they are a trade union member or perhaps they've had a lot of trade union experience, you cannot decide you're a bit careful or skeptic of trade unionism, and therefore you will rather not appoint this person. You cannot use that as a reason for not appointing a person. That would be a contravention of the right to freedom of association and also a form of discrimination then. With freedom of association, we have organizational rights. The legislation provides for collective bargaining. Collective bargaining can only work if you grant trade unions, and the opposite is also true, employers' organizations, but our focus is on the relationship with trade unions today. So trade unions have access to various rights in the workplace. These rights are not automatically granted. There's a process to be followed for trade unions to be granted organizational rights. But in your environment, remember when we looked at the role players, we looked at the Education Labor Relations Council and the trade unions that are parties to that council. And in terms of the bargaining council agreement, those parties automatically have, or the trade unions automatically have these organizational rights. So they don't have to apply for it. They have already been granted these organizational rights. And what does it mean for you? In terms of your environment, there's a right to access to the workplace. It means that a trade union representative, official of a trade union, may enter the workplace in your environment, that will be the school. And they may come into the workplace, for instance, to hold meetings with their members, there's in some instances in labor relations, before a strike, for instance, they will have to conduct a ballot. And for all those purposes, they will have to enter your premises, and they have the right to do so. Deduction of trade union subscriptions or levies, it will most likely not be something that you will have to deal with, but simply means that for these trade unions, the membership fees will be deducted directly from their salaries, and it will be paid over by the department to their respective trade unions. Also, they have the right to elect trade union representatives, and it's quite possible that you may have some educators in your schools that are trade union representatives, and they typically have functions which includes, for instance, representing their members in grievance and disciplinary proceedings. They also monitor whether the employer is in compliance with the various acts and collective agreements. If they are not in compliance, they may report these contraventions to the department, but also to the trade unions and to the bargaining council. And these trade union representatives have the right to take time off during working hours to conduct certain activities, and we will have a look at that in a bit more detail. They also may or should be granted leave for certain trade union activities that we will discuss, and they have the right to obtain certain information. And this information is typically the information that they need to conduct their various functions. It doesn't mean that everything is open to them. There's still information that is, for instance, legally privileged, or that is confidential, or that is private and personal to a certain employee that you cannot share. So it's not open for all. You will have to be very engaged, perhaps, with your labor relations officers in your districts or department if you are unsure about which information you can share with your trade union representatives. In the department, the provincial departments and the Department of Education, the national department, all the organizational rights are awarded to the parties, as I've indicated previously. These rights may also be awarded to other trade unions if they apply for them, but they will have to meet a 30% membership level within a particular workplace before that will be granted. As a school principal dealing with labor relations matters, I don't foresee that this is something that you will be involved with. That will most likely be dealt with at a district or a departmental level. Okay, we've talked about the right of trade union officials, trade union representatives, and trade union members to take time off, and this is official working time, for certain trade union related reasons. Now, what is important is the amount of time that they take off to deal with these labor relations matters should be reasonable and fair. Now, unfortunately, as with many of the things in labor relations matters, there's no clear answer in terms of what is reasonable and what is fair. But I will show you that there was some collective agreements and circulars that was published, which provides some more detail in terms of what is allowed. When you get a request for time off, there's certain things that you need to consider. Firstly, teaching and learning is still the most important thing in your school environment, so that needs to continue. You need to look at the productivity levels. People need to still work, so they can't spend all their time. They are first and foremost employees and educators. So there needs to be a balance. They need to still be effective and efficient in their roles as educators. It is important to have order in the education system, because it affects our children. Our children have the constitutional right of education. So we need to make sure that that constitutional right is upheld in our school environment. So any considerations in terms of time off, you must also think about how that will impact the children and education, training and teaching in your environment. When a person requires time off to engage in union activities, there must be a reasonable period of time where possible. If there are meetings that need to be attended, those meetings should be held after school hours or alternatively then during breaks. There must be very accurate record keeping, and this will be required from the trade union, where they will have to provide evidence of those meetings and the people who have attended those meetings. And also the trade union need to inform you if there are any trade union members or representatives who have resigned from the trade union, so that you know that they will not be engaging in trade union activities. Now, there are various roles that trade union representatives, officials, and members can take, and for which they might require time off. Firstly, if we look at trade union representatives, they are allowed, in terms of the guidelines that were published, certain time off during school hours to attend meetings, and this can be at national or at provincial levels for collective bargaining purposes. In other words, if they are part of the team engaging in negotiations. This will not be all your trade union representatives, typically the more senior ones. They may also need time for preparation for these negotiations. Once again, there needs to be reasonable time notice. They can't just drop it at the last minute to tell you that they can't be there. They need to provide proof to show you that they have actually been nominated by the trade union to attend these meetings and to take part in the negotiations. Once again, you will have to have confirmations of these meetings before the meetings and also after the meetings to see that this person has actually attended. What they are allowed is 1 school day per event for preparatory meetings. In other words, before they can get time off for the negotiations, and then 1 day per event also to prepare for these negotiations. And that will be regarded as special leave with full pay. Most of you will not have to deal with employees or trade union representatives who are involved in collective bargaining, but when it comes to these matters that your shop stewards typically deal with, it might be more something that you might deal with. Trade unions or representatives or shop stewards, as we commonly call them, are allowed reasonable time off during school hours to carry out their tasks as shop stewards. And these tasks and time off have been agreed between the parties, the trade unions, in the Education Labour Relations Council. So it has already been determined those are the guidelines that apply. The duties that they typically perform is they represent their members in disciplinary hearings, in grievance and dispute procedures, aspects that might relate to redundancy or retrenchment, in other words, those consultations, as well as any dismissals. They may also be required to attend labour relations training, and in some instances, they might attend or participate in workplace forums. Now, the provisions that apply there is that the days leave that they can use for this may not exceed a maximum of 3 school days at a time, and it is limited to a maximum of 12 school days per annum. Right, so that will once again be time off with full pay, and it must be reasonable and fair. So there needs to be discussion between remember that the shop steward has a dual role. A shop steward is firstly an employee of the Department of Education. He works as an employee. That person will have certain teaching responsibilities, but the person also has a role to play in the trade union, and this is what this provides for, but once again, it's not unlimited. There are certain limitations. Then you've got your trade union members. Many of you have teachers who are members of trade unions, and they also have the right to take time off to participate in trade union activities. Please keep in mind that the right to freedom of association says they have the right to participate in lawful trade union activities. So that is why we need to look, for instance, if we look at strikes and picketing, what are the legal requirements for those actions? They cannot take part, for instance, in a strike and vandalize property and say, but yes, they may do that because it's part of a strike and they've got the right to freedom of association. Okay, also very importantly, the time that a trade union member can take off for trade union activities must be agreed upon between the employer and the trade union. And it will only be considered if the academic program is not interrupted. It must be prearranged, it must be agreed between the parties. It can include, for instance, meetings that these members need to attend. If information is, for instance, shared by trade union officials, they might be expected to vote during trade union elections or before a strike commences. Once again, this is limited. It's limited to 8 school hours per annum, and it's calculated from the 1st of January to the 31st of December. So it's not indefinite. Something that you need to remember is, for instance, a strike action would not be regarded as part of these activities. A strike action is something different that is intended to put pressure on the employer to accept a certain demand. So that is not included here. These are normal trade union activities, such as meetings and ballots that they participate in. Are you still with me? Just a thumbs up to see whether everything is still fine. Okay, I've got one. Thank you, Ridwan. Anyway, many of you may have had to deal with strikes and picketing in your environments because of the high volume of trade union presence in, amongst others, the education context. Trade union members are allowed to participate in a strike, but it must be a protected strike. Now, what do we mean by a protected strike? It means that there first needs to be a dispute. I will talk about a dispute in a bit more detail just now, but there must be a dispute. Just up and go and decide that this is now a strike. That dispute must have followed the normal dispute resolution procedures, referred to a bargaining council or the CCMA. In your case, it will be the Education Labour Relations Council. There must be a certificate of non-resolution or at least 3 days since the dispute was raised, and there must be a 7 days notice of the strike. If these conditions are not met, it means that in terms of the law, the strike will not be protected, and participating in that strike then results in misconduct. It is seen as misconduct, and the people who have then participated in that strike can be disciplined in terms of the normal disciplinary procedures for misconduct. What you must also remember is that the no work, no pay principle applies. What does this mean? Often there's a misconception amongst trade union members and managers as well that if it is a protected strike, it means that they must still get paid, which is not accurate. If it's a protected strike, it basically means that the action is protected, so you cannot be disciplined for engaging in a protected strike. But you will not have to be paid because you haven't rendered your services. Pay is dependent on rendering your services. In this case, that is not happening, so there's no reason to pay you. What is also important in your context is there needs to be a strike management plan in place. Luckily for you, you don't have to develop this strike management plan. There is a strike management plan that was published by the, I just want to open this quickly. Let me show you what it looks like. I'm not going to show you what it looks like. I'll show you just now. Okay, there's a strike management plan in place, and that basically means that at every level, and this boils down from the National Department of Education, the regional offices, the provincial offices, and the schools itself need a particular plan that they will follow in the event of a strike. Now, what this means for you is you need to be prepared for strike action. As a head of a school, it is your responsibility to ensure that education will continue. You don't have the right to close the school until the strike is ended. Unfortunately, that is not an option. You need to put measures in place to make sure that the school will still be operational. And it's easy to say. I know that it's not as easy to do, but it's important for you to put those measures in place. Some, for instance, is security. How are you going to deal with security matters? How are you going to deal with communication? As the head of a school, if, for instance, it becomes something that's newsworthy, you are not permitted to speak to the media. Such events, or if there's something and the media wants to contact you, they will have to liaise with the department who will deal with those matters. Something that is very interesting, which I saw in the regulations, is I was not aware of it. You are most probably aware of it, is that there also needs to be a parent committee that will assist during this during a strike, and that needs to be at least 5 members. And that parent committee will then liaise with other parents and communicate with them during the strike. So that was quite interesting to me. I was not aware of that fact. Let's just start at the bottom. I've referred to grievances, I've referred to disputes, but let's just see how they fit together. You deal with various matters in your context and your relationship with your employees where they have issues, whether it's work-related or whether it's just personal relationships where people don't see eye to eye and so on. So that we regard as a complaint. Anything that just causes unhappiness, that's a complaint. It's still informal. There's no formal procedure that needs to be followed. But any of your employees can come to you and raise a complaint and discuss it. In an informal matter, there's no record keeping, and you try to resolve the matter internally. When does it become a grievance? It becomes a grievance when the formal procedure starts. In other words, there was a complaint and you've tried to resolve it internally. It's not happening. And the employee then has the right to lodge a grievance. And then it's a formal procedure. There's specific forms that need to be completed and specific actions that need to be taken. Grievances are typically not regulated by law, but in your context, in the education environment, there are some regulations that do apply. What is a dispute then? Why is it not the same thing as a grievance? A dispute is at a higher level. It typically, a dispute is declared if, for instance, a grievance cannot be resolved. If you've gone through all the steps in the grievance procedure and you haven't resolved it, then you declare a dispute and it goes to an external party to resolve the dispute. The same applies to, for instance, dealing with discipline, where you've gone through the disciplinary process and the employee might be dismissed and they are not happy with the outcome, and a dispute is, for instance, referred then to the relevant body. This is how it all fits together. Now, what do we want to do? Do we want to get there? No. Do we want to get there? Not really. We want to hopefully deal with the matters at this level. Yes, there will be complaints. Any relationship deals with conflict, and that is what Liesel and Louise also touched on, is how do you interact with people? This is where you deal with it in an informal manner. And hopefully most of the issues will be dealt with there. If you listen actively, you've listened to their presentation, and you deal with those matters proactively. But unfortunately, some issues will not be resolved. And for that, then we need a formal procedure. I'll get back to that slide. Sorry. This is the grievance procedure. So what is the grievance procedure? This is what we want to put in place to make sure that those complaints that become formal grievances are dealt with as soon as possible and as close to the root of that grievance as possible. You don't want it to escalate. You don't want it to become a dispute, and you don't want it to become a collective action, for instance, a strike. So we need to do that as soon as possible so that everyone is satisfied with the way that it's been dealt with. Now, typically, the sources of grievances relate to behavior of either employees or management, breaching contract, unfair labor practices, issues with relationships, unequitable or perceived unfair treatment, harassment, which is unfortunately a huge thing in the education sector, for specifically sexual harassment. It's unsettling how many cases of sexual harassment we see in the education environment. And then discrimination. Issues about the aspects such as wages and conditions of employment are typically not dealt with as grievances, but those issues are dealt with as part of the collective bargaining process. Now, how do you deal with a grievance? If you look here on the left-hand side, that's what I explained. It's the informal part of the process. There's a perceived act of unfairness or omission. And the employer, the educator, remember we're looking at educators here, they will raise it with maybe a department head in your school or with yourself as the school principal, and you will deal with it informally. If it's resolved, that's wonderful. It's the end of the road. No further action is needed, and there's no documentation needed either. If it's not resolved, then the employee or the educator has the option to lodge a formal grievance. And this means that there are certain forms that need to be completed, certain time limitations in terms of what actions need to be taken within specific times. Okay, I'm not going to go through every step of the process in detail. I just want you to see that there's a specific process that needs to be followed and times involved in following this process. There will be a meeting with the grievant where it will be discussed. There will be communication with the department where you will liaise on the appropriate action that needs to be taken. And in each instance, you will decide, is this matter now resolved or not? If the employee or the grievant feels that it's resolved, then no further action is necessary. The necessary documentation will be sent to the department. If, however, it's not resolved, it will go to higher levels. It will then go to the education, the department, where it will be dealt with by the officials there. They also have certain time spans in which it needs to be resolved. And then you can see here at the end, if all those steps have been followed and the grievant is still not satisfied, it will be referred to the Education Labour Relations Council, where they will deal with the dispute. Okay. What I want to show you in terms of dispute resolution, and just a note on the grievance procedure, yes, they can be represented, any grievant can be represented by a trade union member, or sorry, a shop steward. If the person is not a trade union member, they can be represented by any other employee. And the parties may also, by agreement, extend the times taken for the various actions. Sometimes it's a very complicated matter and it's not possible to complete it within the limited time span, but there needs to be agreement on that. What I want to show you is just in terms of disputes. We talked about disputes, and at the end of the grievance, if it's not resolved, then the grievant or the educator has the right then to declare a dispute, which means that it's referred to the Education Labour Relations Council. Now, if we look at disputes in labour relations, there are two kinds of disputes, either a dispute of interest or a dispute of right. And there's a reason why it's important for you to differentiate between these types of disputes. Firstly, we have disputes of interests. What does this mean? This is a dispute that arises from a situation where there's no existing right. So there's a certain concern by either an employer or an employee, and you would like that to become the norm, but it's not yet a rule. It's not yet a right that has been established. And what happens here, you resolve it by means of collective bargaining, negotiations and industrial action. And what is typical of this, for instance, if you've got wage negotiations, if the say the employees are not happy Thank you for listening to me. I hope that you learned something in the process. And yeah, good luck. It's not an easy job to deal with these matters.
Thank you very much. A big thank you to Monica. I think everyone enjoyed your practical and eye-opening session on labor relations and legal compliance. And I think all of us learned how these rights and responsibilities and processes can support us in leading with confidence. And thank you all for availing yourself to join us today.